Um, so Friends of the Earth is part of the campaign that we launched about 18 months ago called the BlackRock's Big Problem Campaign. And in our campaigns on deforestation, which is what I primarily work on at FOUS, we have been for some years targeting financial actors as sort of the lever of change to bring to environmental and social change, reform. And as I dive into why BlackRock, I thought it would be helpful to just ground us in some of the tactics and strategies that we use in finance campaigning for folks who may not be familiar. The key question, or one of them really, is how do we reduce the power of the finance industry and build our power to influence its decisions while also leveraging the existing power of the finance industry to bring about change. And the primary elements of these kinds of campaigns are campaigning for divestment, obviously meaning stopping the money flow, asking for banks and asset managers and insurance companies and institutional investors to pull their money out of bad projects and bad sectors. And then there are campaigns for engagement, where we, rather than pulling the money out, what we want is for the financial actors to leverage their power to drive change. And this happens through shareholder action, working with the shareholders in major companies to get them to put pressure on those companies. It works through getting institutional investors to dialogue with the companies that they own to drive change from the inside, if you will. Happens through proxy voting and annual general meetings, where publicly listed companies are required to report to their shareholders once a year and to vote on key governance issues, and influencing those votes and those meetings has always been a key part of finance campaigning. And then there's campaigns for government regulation and enforcement, of course, which I think a lot of people, at least in the US, have often left out because we have so little hope that our government will take action. But this includes, there's a lot of this going on in the EU, obviously. It includes greater oversight by government regulators, and in the US by the Congress and the Senate, of what financial actors can actually do and can't do legally. And then all of this is always much stronger and more powerful when our campaigns are rooted in grassroots action, and we all know that. And this is actually a picture, just to share. This is a picture from one of our protests outside of BlackRock's San Francisco headquarters from last year, which gives you a sense of what grassroots power looks like a little bit in this campaign. About 2 years ago, a number of groups working on both fossil fuels and deforestation got together and said, when we're doing all these finance campaigns to stop deforestation and stop fossil fuel extraction, one name keeps coming up, and it is BlackRock, which is the largest asset manager in the world. Manages over $7 trillion in assets, and is invested in literally every public company in the world, and is the number 1, 2, or 3 top shareholder in most companies, and certainly in the fossil fuel sector and in the commodity sectors that drive deforestation. And we brought together essentially Friends of the Earth, Amazon Watch, Sierra Club, Rainforest Action Network, the Sunrise Project, and a number of other great groups in the US to sort of take a full spectrum approach on BlackRock, by which I mean we're doing, it's a campaign for divestment, it's a campaign for engagement, it's a campaign to bring to bear the power of government on BlackRock. And because BlackRock is so massive, there's no way we're going to move this firm without, a big, united global effort. And this is a video for folks. I was going to show this, but if you, we can send that link afterwards. that tells the story of the campaign, because the story of the campaign to some degree is that 2 years ago, all of these groups came together and said, let's target BlackRock. And we started working with progressive investors, with senators and congressional offices, and with others to draw attention to the fact that unless we change BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, there's no way we're going to get through, to the other side of the climate crisis. And so we published a number of reports. We wrote a bunch of letters to legislators, and we started sort of seeding the campaign among grassroots groups in the US and in Europe. And just to say, let's see, in April of 2019, we had the first protest at a BlackRock headquarters in San Francisco, timed to the Goldman Environmental Prize. And we had, I'd say, less than 20 people there. And within 6 months, by September of 2019, we had thousands of people in the streets under the youth climate strike who were choosing to make BlackRock one of their targets. And so the campaign ramped up incredibly quickly. We've found that people really resonate in the grassroots with the fact that BlackRock is the world's largest asset manager, that it has so much power over so many companies, that it's the largest investor in fossils and deforestation, and also this very difficult and mysterious piece to many of us, which is that BlackRock's primary approach is passive investing. It kind of spearheaded this approach. So it is not actively managing most of the companies that it owns, but it's piling literally trillions of dollars into companies in all of the worst sectors, which we call this zombie investing, or zombie funds, where essentially it puts the global economy, the extractive economy, on autopilot at precisely the time when we need more power than ever to rein in these companies. And so again, I guess this is just looking at, so one of the reasons we chose BlackRock as well, aside from their sheer scale and power, is their CEO, Larry Fink, sends out a letter every year saying that companies should serve a social purpose. And he's sort of known as the conscience of Wall Street, and he certainly doesn't speak his or walk his talk, as we say. So we thought that, the hypocrisy, the gap between Larry Fink's rhetoric and BlackRock's action is so vast that we could exploit that to bring about change. And indeed, we have, wherein as the campaign ramped up, mostly focused on fossil fuels throughout 2019, in August and September of last year, of course, the Amazon fires grabbed world attention, and we put out a report on BlackRock's big deforestation problem at that point, and it really shined a spotlight. We got a lot of media attention, shined a spotlight on the fact that BlackRock is invested in all of the companies burning down the Amazon. And a few months later, in January of this year, BlackRock made this announcement that they are going to put climate change at the center of their business model. And they're divesting their active funds of coal, and they're making a number of changes, which I'll get into right now. But campaign-wise, part of what this led to is bringing the BlackRock campaign into an even larger and broader campaign called Stop the Money Pipeline, which is groups targeting BlackRock and JP Morgan Chase, and essentially all of the big banks and financiers. And one part of my pitch here is that everybody involved in the biomass world who wants to do some finance campaigning should join the Stop the Money Pipeline campaign. So the demands of the campaign, again, are multifold. We want BlackRock to divest from fossil fuels, starting with coal, and to offer fossil-free funds by default, meaning when an institution buys, shares of, hires BlackRock to manage its funds, the default option should be funds that do not contain fossil fuel stocks. If you want fossil fuel stocks, then you have to ask for them. Similarly with deforestation, we're asking for default deforestation-free funds. We're also asking, in the case of deforestation, divestment is much more complicated because we're talking about agribusiness. And so we're asking for time-bound engagement leading to divestment, meaning what we want BlackRock to do is aggressively engage with the companies it owns that are driving deforestation. And if those companies don't change their practices, then BlackRock should pull out its money. We also want BlackRock to clean up its ESG funds. ESG means environmental, social, and governance. That's the term for sort of funds that that are oriented towards sustainability. And BlackRock, because it's so big, is also a leader in providing ESG funds. But we've done the analysis and seen that many of BlackRock's ESG funds include, fossil fuel companies, deforestation drivers, and so forth. So they need to clean up those funds. And then BlackRock needs to vote in favor of climate resolutions. There's reports we can share later that show that in BlackRock's proxy voting, it has voted consistently against every resolution in favor of climate disclosure and in favor of transition to a clean energy economy. And so again, this is a way in which BlackRock does not walk its talk. And as we get into biomass, I guess the decision has been made where biomass fits in this set of demands, which we'll hear about later. And so in January 2020, BlackRock announced a new set of policies that aim to put climate change and sustainability at the center of BlackRock's business model. Does this end the campaign? Not by any means. The policies only cover a tiny amount of BlackRock's portfolio and only exclude a fraction of coal companies, and none of the policies address BlackRock's human rights and deforestation problems. And we've got an analysis, a full analysis of the policies at the website you see here, larrysletter.com. And so, what we know now from this announcement is that popular power can move and has moved BlackRock, just hasn't moved them enough yet. BlackRock's coal divestment, which is extremely relevant for where we want to go on biomass. It requires that companies with 25% or higher revenue from thermal coal production be excluded from BlackRock's active funds by the middle of this year. It takes thermal coal out of all of BlackRock's ESG funds, and it prohibits BlackRock from investing in thermal coal at the same exclusion level going forward. What's good about the policy is it's in fact the largest divestment policy ever in terms of assets under management, because the funds that it applies to are $1.8 trillion. It's good that BlackRock will not have any new investments in coal in their alternative products, which is certainly something we can and should ask vis-a-vis biomass. And yeah, again, that BlackRock's moving thermal coal out of its ESG funds. We have big questions about how the policy applies beyond coal producers. Does it apply to mining companies? Does it apply to utilities? We have big questions about whether BlackRock will revise the thermal coal policy in line with the global coal exit list, which would require it to ratchet down its thresholds over time. There's no timeline set for the commitment to phase out thermal coal from its ESG products, so it's still selling them right now. And the definitions are lacking as well. And I put biomass with a number of question marks in there because that's one of our goals here, is to see how we can get BlackRock to build biomass into this commitment. Next. And as I begin to wrap up, just to say, one of the things that I think is really unique and important about the BlackRock's Big Problem campaign is that it is the first time that we've seen a large-scale campaign that brings together the fossil problem and the deforestation problem. And I think there's a lot of power in that. I don't need to go over the basics of the drivers of deforestation, I think, for this crowd. But just to say, when we're talking about deforestation, we're talking about agro-commodity driven deforestation, soy, beef, palm oil, timber, rubber, paper, and pulp. And knowing that we have some folks from Europe's Great North Woods here, just to say we're mostly focused on the tropics so far, but there's certainly room to expand. BlackRock is among the top 3 shareholders in 25 of the world's largest deforestation risk companies, per the report we put out last year, BlackRock's Big Deforestation Problem. And we learned in the research for that report that BlackRock's investments in these companies have increased by more than $500 million since 2014. So this is typical across the market. So one of the things that we've won from BlackRock on agribusiness and deforestation is that just after putting out its policy on climate change, BlackRock quietly published a statement on its approach to engagement with agribusiness. So again, it shows that we're moving them. The statement acknowledges risks, including greenhouse gas emissions, illegal deforestation, biodiversity loss, waste and water management. It acknowledges social factors, including land rights, indigenous peoples' rights, workers' rights, health and safety, bribery and corruption. And it reiterates BlackRock's on-paper commitment to intensify its focus and engagement with companies on sustainability-related risks. So as a document, it's pretty significant, but it's not a policy. It's simply a sort of a commentary. There's no high-level policy on agribusiness or deforestation. There's no requirement to disclose scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions from agribusiness, which I think will also apply to the biomass work. There's a nod to human rights, but no human rights policy. And there's not what we essentially want, which is for BlackRock to engage transparently, again, with the companies that it owns in a time-bound way that drives towards potential divestment. So that's the very quick, sorry I'm speaking so fast, but wanting to get to the meat of the biomass stuff here. That's a quick overview of what we've started doing on BlackRock, and to say that we need everybody in so that we can get BlackRock out of biomass. Thank you for listening. I guess the quick and dirty way of getting into that would be to say BlackRock is an asset manager. What an asset manager does is it's a money manager. Essentially, if you are an asset owner, which could be an individual, could be a university, could be a city pension fund, you know, anybody that has money that they want to be managed and invested to get returns from the market, you will hire an asset manager to manage those funds. And what that asset manager will do is invest in public equities, which means shares of companies across the market. And an asset manager essentially then owns shares of all of these companies. So when we say BlackRock owns every company in the world, it means BlackRock owns a significant number of shares in many companies, which then gives BlackRock a certain amount of, or any asset manager, a certain amount of power to drive the governance decisions that occur in those companies. So it's in that sense that asset managers are, because they're not banks, you know, we don't see them on the street. It's not, they're generally not public facing institutions, but they actually manage a huge proportion of the global economy and invest it in all of the companies that they own. So it's a little bit of a new campaign approach to recognize that if we want to change global finance, we have to recognize that these massive asset managers who've like all other industries, they've concentrated incredibly over the last few years, over the last couple of decades, where there are just a handful of large asset managers that really dominate the industry. And they have controlling power over many companies across the global economy. So if you have a pension fund or an IRA or a 401k through your employer, it's invested by some asset manager, and pretty difficult to find out. I mean, it's doable, but it's tedious and boring for most of us, you know, to see where the money's invested. And that's part of how it works, is you're invested in things you probably don't know and wouldn't want to be invested in if you did know.
Yes, thank you. Yes, so I'm from Biofuelwatch, and our biggest campaign in the UK, where Fran and I and most of us are based, is called Drax against Drax Power Station. And for those, I'm really in this presentation just giving an overview about who Drax are, for those not really familiar with them. The reason we are focusing on Drax here is that BlackRock's main, to our knowledge from our research, BlackRock's main investment in biomass is in Drax PLC. I mean, BlackRock invests in a lot of energy companies that have biomass as a small part of their portfolio. However, Drax is the only one that we could find for whom biomass is the main part of their business, and in which Drax holds, well, in this case, I think about 5% of BlackRock holds about 5% of Drax's shares. So Drax is, this is Drax Power Station in Yorkshire. It's the single biggest carbon emitter in the UK. Next, please. It used to be the UK's largest coal power station. It has a capacity of just under 4 gigawatts, which is really, really huge. It's bigger than any other power station of any type in this country. Here's a picture back from 2006, when it was actually the target of the first climate camp in 2006, which, you know, people may have heard of the, you know, the subsequent climate camp. Next, please. Now, starting in 2012, Drax decided that was kind of the time when coal phase out first came into the political discussion. And so in 2012, Drax made a decision to start converting half their capacity, so 3 out of 6 units initially, since then a 4th one, from coal to wood pellets. So they currently have 4, but only 3 are actually running at any one time. This picture is from when the construction of the biomass silos, which are those domes, that's where they keep the wood pellets. So since then, you know, the 4th one has been converted, but they're running half the capacity. 2 units continue to burn coal, but they have been phasing that out. There's only about 4% of Drax's electricity currently comes from coal, and they will stop them and shut them down around 2022. Next, please. Now, how does that translate, this capacity translate into demand for wood? So looking at the annual report, last year, Drax burned 7.05 million tons of wood pellets. You need at least twice, actually a little bit more than that, in green wood, i.e. freshly cut wood. Now, importantly, a power station such as Drax, that applies to most coal power stations in the world, is technically only capable of burning pellets made from virgin wood with a low bark content, and trees that are not particularly fast growing, so they couldn't, for example, burn eucalypt. There's a picture of one of the pellet plants in Canada that is understood to supply some of Drax's pellets. You know, you can see lots and lots of whole logs waiting to be processed. Next, please. Where do the pellets come from? It's a little bit small to read, so apologies. But the biggest one in blue is from the USA. So 65%, 65% of Drax's pellets come from the US. And then the next big you can see, which is much smaller, is from Canada, and the gray one is from the Baltic states. And I haven't separated them out because it's very hard to know which country delivers wood originally from which other Baltic states. So you'll be hearing from the next speakers about wood from the US and Estonia and the Baltics. Next, please. how they're being financed, it's entirely dependent on subsidies. So last year they received the equivalent of 2.1 million pounds or 2.69 million US dollars every single day in subsidies. This year it's probably slightly higher. Um, so yeah, it is heavily, heavily subsidized, and it's very clear from the annual reports that their business will not be financially viable without subsidies. And all this, burning. Sorry, I forgot to say earlier. So on the last slide, you don't have to go back, but I was also wanting to mention that the wood that they burn is equivalent to 122% the amount of wood produced in the UK for all purposes every single year. So burning way more wood than the UK produces annually, with all those subsidies, they generate about 0.8% of the UK's total energy demand. Next, please. Now, I'm not going to go into climate science or anything, but I think most people will be aware that this isn't great for the climate. Per unit of energy, Drax emits 3% more carbon dioxide from wood burning than it does from burning coal. And then I've cited, I've given a quote, about how bad this is from an open letter signed by 800 scientists. Now, and just to mention that although Drax is now very much predominantly a biomass burning business, they haven't actually given up on fossil fuels either. Drax last year acquired 2 gigawatt worth of existing gas power station capacity elsewhere in England. Here's a photo of one of them. And they're trying to build the UK's biggest ever gas power capacity in lieu of the 2 coal units, so but bigger, much about twice the size of the coal units. This is the approval, the permit they got for that is currently being challenged in the High Court by the environmental NGO Client Earth. Next, please. So yeah, so this is basically, ever since, I don't know, probably 2013 or 14, I can't even remember when we started, but we've been really focusing on the Drax campaign, working with anti-coal, anti-gas, and forest campaigners, climate campaigners in the UK and beyond in other countries, including, the groups you'll hear from next, focusing very much on trying to stop the subsidies, at least get them reduced. But we increasingly feel that it's also really, really important that we start increasingly looking at the investors, looking at the big shareholders, and strengthening pressure by focusing on them, in addition to the campaign for policy and subsidy changes. Okay, I think that's me. So yeah, they are burning a mix from different regions of hardwood and softwood, and you're actually the picture I used is from a very new report by Standard just come out from about British Columbia, but you're going to get a lot more details about where the wood comes from in the biggest sourcing region next from Rita from the southern USA, and then later from Team from about the Baltic states.
My name is Rita Frost. I'm the campaigns director at Dogwood Alliance, and my presentation is mostly going to be focusing on the intersection of forest, climate, and justice, which really fits in nicely with this BlackRock campaign. I have a lot of slides. They're predominantly photos though, so I'll be moving Fran along quickly. Okay, with that being said, Fran, next slide, please. So a little bit about us. Dogwood Alliance, we were formed in 1996 in response to the devastating impacts that a major expansion of the US paper industry it was having on southern forests in the United States. We worked on paper companies predominantly to reform their practices, and we have increased protection for millions of acres of southern forests through transforming the forest products industry. Today, we are primarily working on the most pressing issue to southern forests, which is the biomass industry. And a large part of this is being driven by Drax and by the UK, calling and determining that burning biomass, burning forests, is a quote unquote clean energy source for electricity. And it's a way for them to meet carbon neutral targets. And this is actually causing a lot of degradation of our forests in the southern United States. And it's actually the third largest cause of carbon pollution, just behind cars and power plants. So let's start off with southern forests and just ask ourselves, why are they so important? If you ask a forester this question, and if you ask a biologist this question, you will get two very different responses. But the way I like to think about this question is really like, what does it mean to you and me? Southern forests are the place that I live. It's the place that I've worked for the last 5 years with Dogwood Alliance. And for Southerners, forests are a place where we hike, it's where we camp, hunt, fish, relax. They are an essential component of maintaining our ecosystems. And furthermore, the forests of the southern United States are so important that they have been named a global biodiversity hotspot, so called because of the amount of endemic species that we have combined with how threatened they are. These are forests that are very varied. You know, we have swamps down in Louisiana, and we also have forests that look like this in North Carolina. The area of forest that Dogwood Alliance works on, and the area that's threatened by biomass, is an area that runs from Virginia down to East Texas and then inland to Tennessee and Kentucky. So our region is important. Part of the reason why it was dubbed a global biodiversity hotspot is because it has the highest concentration of tree species diversity in North America. It has the highest concentration of aquatic diversity in the continental US, including the richest temperate freshwater ecosystem in the world. And it has the highest concentration of wetlands in the United States, 75% of which are forested. That is combined with the fact that even though we have all those beautiful forests, we have about 2% of the world's total forests, and yet we produce a lion's share of the world's wood output. We produce almost 20% of the world's pulpwood. This is why we're the #1 paper producing region in the world, and it's now why we're the #1 producer of wood pellets, which is led by the producer Enviva, who sells to utilities like Drax. For all the pellets that the southern United States produces, we export 98% of them. So we're not using them here domestically. We are exporting them abroad. 4,000 miles across the Atlantic, there is a rail line from the North Seaport to Selby, England, and that transports the pellets along their final leg of the journey to the largest bioenergy station in the world, which Almi's told us about, Drax. It burns them to create enough electricity to power more homes than all in London. There are 4 bioenergy boilers, and they are all burning what they call a quote unquote zero carbon future. So this is just a snapshot of Enviva's impacts to forests and carbon. At Drax, per megawatt hour, the electricity that's generated causes more carbon dioxide pollution than coal. There's over 13 million metric tons. That's about the same that the whole entire state of Delaware in the United States produces in a year. That comes just from Drax. The British government all but ignores it. Drax isn't bothered by it. Drax and Enviva both employ this good biomass defense, quote unquote good biomass defense, saying that there is good biomass and that there is bad biomass, which really belies the core reason why British policy is calling bioenergy carbon pollution as zero. This is a decision that is primarily political. And this is what this carbon neutral energy source looks like when it's being produced. This is an overhead shot of the facility in Hosky, North Carolina. Drax imported about 4.5 million tons of its pellets from the United States last year alone. That's over half. And then there are other major producers in the UK that are importing 1.5 million tons. That's Lynmouth. And then next year, we're expecting that MGT side, which is under construction now, will burn another 1 million tons. So this is a huge demand for wood. And Viva and Drax really like to hide behind greenwashing. They call it a clean, renewable energy source. But I myself, Dogwood Alliance, and several other organizations are seeing a very different story on the ground. Burning wood is causing havoc for our forests and our waterways, as well as our communities, and they're all operating under flawed reasoning. This is another picture from one of our investigations. Dogwood Alliance has been leading investigations since 2013, since the beginning of our campaign, and year after year, we get pictures that look like this, where we show that the industry is clear cutting forests, they are taking whole trees, they are harvesting from endangered and special habitat, and yet they hide behind claims saying that they do not use whole trees. When they eventually admit that they use whole trees, they say that they are using deformed, diseased, small trees that do not meet specifications for saw logs. Well, okay, I understand that argument from the point of forestry. However, when we are talking about why this is happening, it's all happening under climate and environmental policy. So from a climate perspective, it does not matter if the tree is small, diseased, or deformed. That is an important tree that is sequestering and storing carbon every year. Even when they are using residues, the US Forestry Service, as well as North Carolina State University, which are two very conservative organizations, foundations and institutions in the United States, they project that wood use for bioenergy will quickly exhaust wood waste and residuals. And by some accounts, logging rates will as much as double the area of natural forest converted to industrial pine plantations over the next 50 years. They say that it's happening on a life cycle basis. Again, that's just a clever term to hide the facts. And this is actually from the first investigation ever of a biomass harvest by the Wall Street Journal back in 2013. This is a very special bottomland hardwood forest. These are our native forests that we are losing, all in the name of climate change. The other thing that I really want to connect us to when we're talking about Enviva and Drax and BlackRock is that wood pellet production is having an impact on environmental justice communities. And when I say an environmental justice community, what do I mean? We define an environmental justice community as a county where the poverty level is above the state median and at least 25% of the population is non-white. When it comes to wood pellet production facilities that Enviva has, over 50% of those are in environmental justice designated communities. And in addition to that, all of the biomass pellet mills that are in North Carolina and South Carolina, they are all in environmental justice communities. So when I say that we in North Carolina are ground zero for the wood pellet production facility industry, I really mean that our communities are being impacted by this the most. There is a long-standing history in the South of EJ communities being disproportionately targeted for the siting of coal and natural gas power plants, in addition to waste-to-energy plants and landfills. Wood pellet production facilities are very similar to these plants in that their emissions of harmful particulate matter, airborne pollutants such as carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, nitrogen oxides, sulfur oxides, I could go on and on, are harming the air quality of these communities. And furthermore, they are degrading local water quality. So if y'all are further interested in the impact to communities, I really encourage y'all to go to Dogwood Alliance's website and to check out our resources with videos, because every single community that we have worked with to push back against Enviva and to stop wood pellet production facilities being created in their hometowns and in their backyards, we have videos of that, of really capturing the testimonials, and they're quite powerful. What I want to leave us with is further to calling on BlackRock about this being a climate and forest issue, is that this is an investment issue because of the impact that it has on communities and the fact that activists are not behind wood pellet biomass and they are willing to speak up against it. We are working as much as we can to convince BlackRock and to pressure BlackRock to drop their investments in Drax, because we've got about 5-10 years to really turn things around, and it's the timing that counts.
Hello to everyone, and thanks for Biofuelwatch for organizing this. And I also wanted to thank the presenters that came before me, because you explained quite a lot of context, so it made my work much easier. So, but I'm going to talk really shortly about what impact the pellet demand from Drax is having on the forests in Estonia. And I think when we talk about Estonia, the impacts for other Baltic countries are very, very similar. So it's a Estonian example to describe what is happening in Baltics. But first slide is about the forests of Estonia in general. I hope you all more or less know where Estonia is, but it's a small Northern European country, and it's very forested. It's more than half of the landscape is forests, and the country itself is roughly the size of Netherlands, but it's much less populated, so there is a lot of natural or semi-natural landscapes. And I think the context is quite similar to the southern US, where we are not talking about pristine forests, but something of semi-natural. There has been human impacts for these ecosystems previously, and there has been quite a long tradition of forest management, but at the same time they are far from being plantations or very monocultural ecosystems. Over the last decade, the intensity in their management has grown really big times, and we just had the statistics released about the last measured numbers, and it was the highest ever in 2018. 12.7 million cubic meters were harvested from Estonian woods. But at the same time, they are important ecosystems, and about 20,000 different species have been estimated to habit Estonian forests, and they are diverse. It's both conifers and mixed stands. Okay, but then moving to energy use, and I think in this sense Estonia is quite a specific country in the EU, because we tend to have the producing countries and then the consuming countries, like two different sets of problems for each. But Estonia is a big consumer itself, as well as being the second biggest exporter after our southern neighbor Latvia in EU in wood pellets, and is still quite high also in the world ranking. And you have to keep in mind the small size of this country, but it's probably within top 5 countries of the world in biomass exports. So in 2017, our estimate was that if you add up the amount of wood that we use ourselves for energy and the fuel exports, then it's about 8 or more million cubic meters a year, and that's quite a lot. So you can say, more than half for sure of Estonian logging ends up in energy in one way or another, domestically or in some other countries. So it's very difficult to actually quantify, because our forests are logged for different purposes, and it's very rare that you have to actually have a forest logged just for energy, just for pulp, or just for timber, sawmill quality, but they are normally logged and then sold to different purposes, and it's quite difficult to put the finger on and say that this logging was caused because of the energy demand in trucks or so on, but we clearly see, if you look at the actual amounts of wood going to the energy, then it's a clear stimulus for logging intensity, and it has consequences. And what are the problems that come with it? I represent the Estonian Fund for Nature, and I clearly speak of the environmental problems as the biggest one. I guess there are others as well, but one thing we are really concerned about is that Estonia is unable to take care of its biodiversity. We see that both the common forest species numbers are going down, as well as rare species numbers, that habitat forests are going down rapidly. It's estimated that 60,000 pairs of birds are lost every year because of intensive forest management. We also are very concerned that very destructive loggings also happen in protected areas, also in the areas that are protected under European regulations. And we are extremely worried about the very small number or small percentage of still natural forests, the forest that has had very, very little human impact in the past. The percentage is at 2% at the moment, but it's also in decline, and it should not be in this century. It's a big problem. So we are saying that our regulations and policies are not good enough to protect our biodiversity, and it would be at least fair that our foreign trade partners knew about this. And yeah, I just added a photo to describe the forest management versus the conservation. It's a protected area, logging, and yeah, they happen regularly, and they should not happen this way. So then I wanted to talk quickly about safeguarding all kind of negative environmental impacts through the certification schemes. I think we don't need to go very deep to these discussions, but I think several European countries are regulating what kind of timber, what kind of forest products can be used in energy. And this is a recent example from the Dutch standard, which asks the companies to prove that they are actually up to certain kind of environmental standards. There is specifically a point saying that you should pay attention and protect the water bodies while doing your forest operation. And we got to comment this, and the company said that yeah, everything is okay. We have national legislation to make sure that no harm is done. We comment saying that there are no such a sufficient legislation, and finally the auditors said that actually there is. The there is a 10-meter restricted zone around every water body, even the smallest pond in private forest, and this is a very common thing we actually see in nature when we visit these sites. There is nothing, and from the NGO perspective, I could say that there is very little trust and interest to work with these initiatives anymore, because it's very time consuming and and detailed, but has proven to have very little effect on the actual forest management on the ground. So this just illustrates what is behind these nice words that you come across regularly in all kind of certificates. But then, yeah, I wanted to draw your attention to another problem from the climate perspective, and like it's been mentioned before, the biomass burning is considered climate neutral, at least at the point of burning, but even with depending on how happy we are with the climate or carbon accounting rules, the current ones, we still see there is a climate effect somewhere. So I think the producing countries of pellets are actually bearing the cost, and this graph illustrates the foreseen behavior of Estonian sink if the business as usual continues, if the current policy continues. And it says that the LULUCF sector, that's and sector to simplify, would become actually a source of emissions in 2034, and that would actually make our own climate goals very difficult to achieve. So in a way, you, by burning pellets in your country, you are transporting this carbon in our accounting, and also it makes it much more difficult to aim for carbon neutrality. And maybe it's not as big issue here as it is in some other countries, but I can't find it just in any way. So and these graphs would be very difficult if logging was avoided. The recent studies said that the Estonian forests are able to observe or take out about 10 million tons of carbon dioxide a year, if not logged. So the huge potential is lost here, we would say. And then, thank you.
You know, we haven't really looked into it yet. I'm sure, I imagine Rita may know more, but we're really just beginning to look at that. Again, BlackRock is invested in everything, so we can be pretty sure they're invested in everything, deforestation in the US. But that's one of the next phases to figure out.
We know that they're invested in Drax. Follow the line from there. I'm sure that they're invested in Viva. There are also several other large utilities as well as pellet producers that we're concerned with. And so it's now all about following that money, as Jeff laid out at the beginning.
It has also come to my attention from our Gary here at Biofuelwatch that BlackRock is in a number of companies in the Brazilian and Chilean and, you know, South American forests, both in paper and pulp and biomass and everything else. So it's really a question of, I mean, identifying what they're invested in, but being aware that they're invested in all of it and making sure that we push them out. Yeah, we know some of us, and we do actually work with the BlackRock's Big Problem campaign does work with Share Action in the UK and with Majority Action, which is here in the US, and another great group called As You Sow that does a lot of work on shareholder proposals and so forth. But yeah, Share Action has been very helpful so far in the BlackRock campaign. Yeah, Majority Action is the name of one in the USA. That's very similar. Sure. The simple explanation is that there's a couple of different ways that investors put money into equity funds. One is to invest in shares in individual companies, but the other is to invest in index funds. And an index fund is basically a fund that tracks the entire market or an entire segment of the market, meaning the S&P 500, for example, is a fund that contains the 500 top companies in the world and by market capitalization, and an S&P 500 index fund would be a company or would be an investment fund that has slices of each of those companies in it. So you, the investor, buy an index fund as the investment product, which means you're not investing just in one company, but in the 500 companies that are in this fund. And you don't have any control over what companies are or are not in the fund. You can't, well, you can, but the investment industry sort of makes it seem like you can't divest from one company that may be in an index fund, and the rules for engagement with index funds are significantly different. And right now, index fund investing makes up about 2/3 of investment in the US and growing. It's going to outpace what we call passive investing is about to outpace what we call active investing. So it's very important that in that case, it's not something, I mean, BlackRock and others can do, other investment firms can do more to control the way they invest in index funds, but it's also really a regulatory issue. How do we change the rules so that index fund investing becomes much more accountable to, you know, to democratic principles?
Yeah, just briefly, which I think is clear to some of the people in this call for sure, it's just really important that when we speak about deforestation funds and keeping BlackRock free from deforestation, that unfortunately, you know, the destruction that you've seen on Rita's slides and seam slides, none of that is officially deemed to be deforestation. So we have to be quite clear that if we are telling BlackRock not to invest in deforestation, that would, you know, that wouldn't directly immediately cover forest degradation. So which is why, you know, we have it is really in terms of demands important to be aware of. And, you know, of course, you know, our ask in the letter to BlackRock, you know, is quite clear, don't invest in forest biomass.